This is lecture one. I'm very grateful to have two lectures because, a lot of times I'm asked to talk about Soviet anti-Semitism in 5 to 7 minutes, and it's slightly tough. Okay, so we'll be talking today about Soviet history of anti-Zionism and Israel demonization. So I'd like to start with two slides. Here's slide number one. So this is a cover of a French edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a 1920s edition. So what are we seeing here on the cover? We are seeing a Jew portrayed as a spider. How do we know that it's a Jew? Because of the exaggerated Jewish features, right? It's kind of a staple of anti-Semitic cartooning about Jews. It's a Jew who is both supernatural, or rather super powerful, because this is a spider that's holding the world in its tentacles, and also subhuman, right? Because it's a spider, and this is an important motif of anti-Semitism that I think was mentioned here, but I think it bears emphasizing that the way anti-Semitism differs from other forms of prejudice is that the anti-Semite doesn't just look at the Jew from kind of as being below him. He looks at the Jew both as being below him, but also as a source of power, which gives the anti-Semite the reason to say, well, justice is on my side. I'm fighting against this evil power that's holding the world in its hands. This Jew has a Bolshevik cap on it. Why is that? Because in the 1920s, this was the biggest fear. Remember, anti-Semitism is something that mutates depending on what is the greatest danger that the society is facing today. I think Naya mentioned it today, others have mentioned it before. But again, it's important to understand that anti-Semitism mutates like a virus. And so in the 1920s, the biggest fear that Europeans feel is that there is a Bolshevik threat coming from the East. And so here is your representation of that. Now, I want to say a couple of words about the protocols because I don't think we've really dwelled on them too much, but it's really, really important. How many of you have heard about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Raise your hands higher so that I can see. Okay. How many of you have actually read them? Okay. Okay, it's a good number, but this is typical. I think the protocols in a way are mythical. It's like we all know what they're about, but very few people have read them. And I have to say that, setting aside the horrible ideas that they represent, it's a really badly written book. It's very, very hard to read. And if you want to know more about it, Christine will be speaking more about that because she's a real expert here on the protocols. But the protocols, of course, are one of the most influential books of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory, again, another concept that really bears emphasizing. It's really important. We'll talk about it more because the conspiracist aspect also begins to penetrate the anti-Zionist conversation, very much so. And so we'll get to that. That's why I'm emphasizing it now. So anti-Semitism is not just prejudice against Jews. It is fundamentally a conspiracy theory, right? The belief that a Jew, like we see here, controls the world and pulls the strings. And the protocols they are the expression of this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory par excellence. This book talks about it. It claims to be sort of a transcript of a meeting of Jewish elders who are discussing how Jews are going to achieve world domination, how they're going to establish a tyrannical regime under the guise of democracy, how they're going to buy out media and politicians, to use propaganda to manipulate the world, to lay their hands on global finances. The plot is extremely devious, and it really makes the reader feel as though nothing can be trusted, because everything that meets the eye is an illusion. So even if there is a democracy, you need to remove that layer in order to see the guiding hand of the Jew, who is really pretending to create a democracy for you, but in reality, it's a tool of the Jews' tyrannical aspirations. So there's no solid ground, right? And ultimately, you can't trust anything, which is, of course, in a democracy, it's a very dangerous proposition, because democracies very much depend on trust, which is why anti-Semitism is so dangerous to democracy, because once that kind of anti-Semitic thinking starts to blossom, it begins to undermine the kind of democratic structures. So, so when you read the protocols, you really start to understand the corrupting influence of conspiracy theory. So the protocols are have proven to be a forgery, were proven to be a forgery a long time ago. They were produced in Russia in the early 20th century. By the way, a lot of times people would say that, well, the protocols are right-wing. They represent right-wing anti-Semitism. And anti-Zionism is a left-wing expression of anti-Jewish hate. Well, I'll talk about it more in my second lecture, but it's really important to understand the two are really deeply connected and intertwined. And Soviet anti-Zionism borrowed deeply from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols, in turn, had been anti-Zionist from the beginning, because once the Zionist movement gets going, this is like the worst, the anti-Semites' worst kind of fear and nightmare coming true, because all of a sudden it looks like Jews are organizing, and what are they going to organize for in order to dominate the world? And so actually there is one edition of the protocols that purports to be a transcript of conversations that took place at the First Zionist Congress in 1897. The protocols had a major influence on Hitler and Nazis in general, and the historian Norman Kahn referred to them as a warrant for genocide. It's the title of his very famous book. Russian white immigrants brought the protocols to Europe after the Russian Revolution, and so you see, as we were saying here, it's the Bolshevik threat, the Jewish Bolshevik threat, right, the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. And they, of course, spread to the Middle East, to the United States. Now we get to the topic of my lecture. The Bolsheviks actually outlawed this kind of anti-Semitic propaganda. And for decades, the USSR claimed that it stood at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism, which makes it all the more surprising to see this image, it's a photograph, appear in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Now, I showed this image yesterday. Now we're going to look at it more closely. I mean, what are we seeing here? This is 1972. It's a May Day parade in Moscow. This is a parade float. You see children catching a ride on the float. It's all lovely, the first spring sunshine appearing after a long winter. Everybody's having fun. What is on the float? It's a Jew spider, right? How do we know it's a Jew? Because he wears a hat with the Star of David, and of course there is the crooked nose. And so the question is, how come in the USSR you could have this, given what I just said? Given that anti-Semitic propaganda was outlawed, given that the protocols were outlawed, given that the Nazis had adopted the protocols, and the Nazis, of course, were sort of the key, real, and mythological enemy of the Soviets. The Soviets, Soviet propaganda talked about the Nazis all the time with the USSR positioning itself as the main opponent and defeater of the fascism and the Nazis. So how is this possible? And the answer is, of course, in the words attached to the image. According to these words, which if you speak Russian or read Russian, you already know what it says, and if you don't, then I will tell you. What it says here is that Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. So this is not about a Jew. This is about a Zionist. Now, I want to ask you a question. Actually, those of you who don't speak either French or Russian, you are at an advantage here. Because if you don't speak either language, then you look at these images, and they're basically the same. So is there really a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? And what does it matter when we try to change the words but keep the same imagery? I mean, images are extremely powerful, right? Propagandists know it. Nazis knew it. The Soviets knew it. And if we have time today, and if not today, then next time, we'll compare some of the anti-Zionist cartoons that the Soviets produced. We'll compare them to some of the anti-Zionist images that we see today in the left-wing press. And we'll talk about, again, let's start thinking about are they anti-Semitic or are they anti-Zionist? Or are they both? Okay? So once again, you see purportedly far-right propaganda, purportedly left-wing propaganda agreeing on this idea that a Jew is both subhuman and super powerful, and the Jew controls everything. Okay, so let's now delve a little bit more into some of the history that I want to present today. So first of all, I grew up in the USSR. My story is somewhat similar to Naya's. I'm just older, and so some of the things that she learned from her parents, I learned myself personally. But like her, I had the same kind of moment when I suddenly started to see these ideas and these slogans appear on American campuses and in the American environment. And the slogans that we thought we escaped from in the Soviet Union. So all of a sudden, No, Zionism is racism. Zionism is fascism. Israel is a settler colonial state. Israel is a tool of imperialism. Zionists are Nazis. Zionists collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is a tool of American foreign policy. The Zionist lobby controls American politicians. American police learned their brutal tactics from Zionists. Zionists invoke anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel. All of this is contemporary progressive conversation, which we heard 50 years ago in the Soviet Union. Okay, so this really piqued my attention, and I started to ask the question, you don't just wholesale reinvent the same slogans, the same ideas, the same motifs, right? The same explanatory logic. It just doesn't happen. So how did these ideas somehow appear all of a sudden in my American life, which I have to say was just, every day I encounter this and it's devastating because I know the history of these ideas. Okay, so the Soviet Union produced these ideas, began doing so in 1967. We'll talk more about the significance of 1967. And what's important is that they propagated them using the power of state-controlled media, the power of a state actor, right? Not just inside the country, but also internationally. And specifically, they targeted the global left and the developing world with these ideas, because at some point, Zionism becomes the Soviet Union's main ideological enemy. Okay, so we'll get to all of that. I argue that it is impossible to understand contemporary left-wing discourse about Zionism and Israel without looking at Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. If we want to be battling contemporary anti-Semitism, that it is as crucial to understand this history as it is crucial to understand the history of Nazi anti-Semitism. And it so happens that we actually know the history of Nazi anti-Semitism really well, but the history of Soviet anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has been completely buried. But they are the source of the ideas, and if we don't understand it, then we fall prey to misconceptions that prevent us from fully grasping what it is that we're dealing with. For example, if we don't know this history, we might think that anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism, which is something that we often hear, right? Anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism. And this is the generation of Jews that's the first one that's encountering this form of anti-Semitism. Well, that is a complete misconception. There were generations of Soviet Jews who lived under this propaganda and know exactly what it does to you as a Jew when a society adopts this kind of broad-based anti-Zionist stance, politically weaponized anti-Zionist stance. We actually know exactly what it means, which is why former Soviet Jews, you won't engage them in a conversation of, what is worse, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. We just know the effects. There's a case study that's 75 years long, right? We're not encountering this for the first time. If we don't know this history, we also fall victim to the idea that this rhetoric is a product of grassroots activism. Look, it's these social justice activists who came up with the idea that Zionism is racism, or that Zionism, or that Israel is a settler colonial state. They just arrived at it on their own. In reality, what we're dealing with is a deeply sophisticated set of ideas. It's a complete ideology that was produced by top-notch propaganda and state security professionals. In cooperation with Soviet Academy of Sciences and state-controlled media, we're dealing with a set of ideas that was honed over decades through trial and error, using target audience that numbered millions of people around the globe, right? So we're dealing with something completely different that a lot of times we think about it, right? Just to put it into perspective for you. And we're sitting here, how many of us are here? I don't know, 50 people? We're doing this part-time when we have time, and we're essentially battling a state actor that's no longer there, of course, but it's left a massive inheritance of ideas. That's what we're dealing with here. Okay, so, so I'll just emphasize what I already said, that what we know from this history is that when a country's political system and culture adopt an anti-Zionist stance, a conspiracist anti-Zionist stance, anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews follow. And so studying this history helps us cut through that debate about whether anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the same or not. And the truth is that in principle, they don't have to be, but in practice, most of the time they are. And again, we'll talk more about why that happens, okay? And it happens in part because of this link between the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and anti-Zionist propaganda. The history of Soviet Jewry, and that's millions of Jews of over 3 generations, is really important. It teaches us lessons about our current moment. Okay, so let's delve into some of the historical context here. So I'm going to give you now a lot of history. So I know that there are people sitting at the table for whom the Soviet Union, it's might as well just be ancient Rome. I totally get it. Listen to what I say. Don't let it overwhelm you. Take what grabs your attention. Let the rest of it sweep over you. But it's important for me to give you this information so that you have the full picture. Okay, I'm going to describe 3 periods of Soviet anti-Zionism. And, there's going to be some Slavic names, which I know sound the same to everyone. Take the ones that you can, leave out the ones you can't. It's okay. All right. And I'm presenting this because these ideas are really, they resonate with some of the things that are happening today. Okay, so from my perspective, the most important period in Soviet anti-Zionism begins in 1967. That's the Six-Day War, and things shift then, and that's when the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign goes global, and that is when it produces these ideas and images that we continue to see today in our progressive spaces. But I want to take us back to the early years of the Soviet Union, because Soviet opposition to Zionism didn't begin in 1967. It actually stretches back all the way to the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened in 1917, and in fact, even before that. So already in 1913, Joseph Stalin, then a young kind of activist in the Russian Bolshevik movement, a close associate of Lenin's, wrote a well-known article, Marxism and the National Question. You can find it online easily. It's not a hard read. It's actually very easy to read. And in that article, he explains why the Bolsheviks stand against Zionism. He explains why the Bolsheviks in particular do not view Jews as a nation, which of course the Zionist claim at the time, the Zionist claim in general, is that Jews are a nation who need to be gathered back in the land where they belong. Well, the Bolsheviks don't believe that Jews are a nation. They're very much opposed to this idea. Why are they opposed to this idea? So I'll get to that in a moment, but let me just say one thing, that Lenin actually was very much against anti-Semitism. He was an outspoken critic of anti-Semitism, of Tsarist anti-Semitism, and the culture of pogroms that it fostered. It was the same culture that gave birth to and assumed the logic of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So Lenin was against it. But he also vehemently opposed Zionism as a solution to the Jewish questions on both theoretical and practical grounds. Now, the Jewish question is the question of the time, right? Everybody's trying to find a solution to this question. The Zionists, the Jewish socialists, the Bund, the Bolsheviks, the Nazis are also trying to find an answer to the Jewish question. Everybody's looking for a solution. So why are the Bolsheviks against Zionism? So for one thing, they view Zionists as fragmenting the revolutionary movement. Because what is the revolutionary movement? It's grounded in the Marxist idea that the proletariat needs to unite in order to fight for its own class interests, right? Proletariat is international. So workers of one country, like workers of the United Kingdom, have more in common with workers in India and with workers in America than they have with their national bourgeoisie, because it's a class issue. So they need to unite in order to fight as a class against the bourgeoisie class. Zionists are saying something different. Zionists are saying, well, a Jewish peddler has more in common with a Jewish banker because we are all part of a nation. And so Jews just need to focus on their national interest. And the Bolsheviks are very much against it. They're also against it because they're internationalists, right? They believe that ethnic differences don't matter and that everybody needs to unite in order, again, it's to fight for, it's the class issue that's central. And for the Bolsheviks, Jews are a really important resource in their fight, in their revolution, because Russian Jews were really the most oppressed group of people in the Russian Empire. They were confined to a certain territory where they lived, the Pale of Settlement. There were limitations on their educational, professional opportunities. They were never emancipated in the way the Jews of Europe had been emancipated in the 19th century. And so, of course, the Bolsheviks view them as an important resource. And here comes Zionists, and they're trying to take away this really important resource from the revolution. And so there is that consideration. But there is also the issue of, they oppose that on theoretical grounds. And you can see that in Stalin's article. So they say that Zionist view of a nation contradicts the Marxist view of a nation. A Marxist view of a nation says that a nation is a people that shares a language, territory, economic activity, and culture. And when you look at the Jews in 1913, they don't share a language. All the Jews in different countries or different kind of territories speak different languages. They have different costumes, they have different cuisine. They certainly don't have shared economic activity. It looks like they're all disparate several people. You could argue that they have nothing in common. And so that's what allows the Bolsheviks to argue this. And so from here, it follows that the only path forward for the Jews from the Marxist perspective is to assimilate. So Jews, their future is to assimilate. And as for anti-Semitism, the Bolsheviks also argue that it would vanish with the arrival of socialism. Socialism rejected ethnic divisions. It was internationalist. It proclaimed friendship of the peoples. And so as soon as socialism is announced, anti-Semitism will vanish. Okay? Now, some of these ideas, if you think about it, we hear some of these ideas today as well. I don't know if some of you remember Bernie Sanders' op-ed in the Jewish Currents a few years ago. It was in the previous presidential campaign. I actually wrote a piece about it. It angered me so much because, in essence, Bernie Sanders is telling American Jews, join our progressive movement, give up your particular interests, join hands with us. As soon as we remove the oppression from everything, everybody's oppression, your oppression will also be removed. Well, that's kind of what the Bolsheviks told Jews in 1917. The problem is that, of course, anti-Semitism did not disappear with the arrival of Soviet socialism. To be sure, the Bolsheviks outlawed pogroms. They outlawed right-wing anti-Semitic propaganda, as I was saying. They abolished the Pale of Settlement. They removed the restrictions that had been weighing on the Jews. And those Jews who accepted the deal that the revolution offered them did well. And what was the deal? Essentially, equality, full rights, social mobility, educational opportunities, any profession. You can be a manager, you can run things, in exchange for embracing the Soviet project, including atheism and including assimilation. And so those Jews who accepted the bargain did really well in the first decade of the Soviet power. But religious and Zionist Jews who refused to shed their beliefs suffered brutal repression. And then comes Stalin, and Soviet internationalism goes out the window, including with regards to Jews, if not in theory, then in practice. But here's what's important to understand also at the same time, that in those early years, that first decade after the revolution, the Bolsheviks are anti-Zionists, but they argue their positions. There is logic to what they're saying. Agree or disagree, and I disagree. It doesn't matter. It's a position that's actually consistent with their Marxist belief. It's well argued. Okay, it deserves a place under the sun. What we see happening later on, particularly after 1967, is that Soviet anti-Zionism becomes conspiracist. There is no more logic to it. There is no more argument to it. It begins to view the world as a conspiracy theory, kind of like what we see in these photographs. Okay. So, and we'll get to that. All right, now we get to Stalin's period, and let me see, what do I have here? Okay, I'm gonna skip through this for now. I'll just give a picture of our Soviet Führer, just so you have something to look at. So Stalin's period is when the first kind of notes of anti-Zionist conspiracism begin to appear. So the paradox of the Stalinist period is, of course, that Stalin actually supported the establishment of the State of Israel, right? Everybody knows that, right? It was really crucial. The Soviet support was really crucial to the establishment of the state. Why did he support the establishment of the State of Israel? Because he presumed that Israel would be friendly toward the Soviet Union, that he was sure that the USSR would be able to impose its influence on Israel. Why? I'll show you a lovely picture. This is a demonstration in 1949, May 1st, in Tel Aviv. There were a lot of kibbutzim. The a lot of early Israelis were really not just socialists, they were actually Stalinists, right? So you see this demonstration, May Day, a picture of Stalin, a picture of Lenin, right? Real loyalty to the party. So Stalin knew this. He knew that a lot of the kibbutzim were very much this way. A lot of them, maybe probably most of them, were run by Jews who came out of the Russian Empire. They spoke Russian. And so he thought that by supporting the state of Israel, he would actually establish a state that would sort of be a foothold for the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And it would help the Soviet Union fight the British Empire in this really important area. But his sentiments changed very quickly because, for one thing, Ben-Gurion proved uninterested in joining the Soviet camp. He made it clear that Israel was taking a pro-Western orientation. And then there was an episode that is very well known in the annals of Soviet Jewish history, which Naya alluded to yesterday. In 1948, this is some literature from the kibbutzim. You see all of the Soviet socialist kind of symbols. Okay, Golda Meir comes to Moscow. Now, I don't know if it's a picture of her actually coming to Moscow, but it's a picture of her coming somewhere. And so she comes in September of 48. She comes to Moscow as the first Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union. And she receives an ecstatic reception from Soviet Jews. Let me show you. You see, these are Soviet Jews who are crowded in front, in a street. You see like a little circle? That's Golda right there. So people are like literally hanging off of lampposts to see her. Jews are writing to the Soviet government asking it to let them go help Israel fight in its war of independence. It's just an incredible. She comes to the Moscow synagogue for Rosh Hashanah, and it's just packed to the gills. Normally, people are afraid to actually come to the synagogue, but now it's just crowded. There's just incredible excitement. And Golda was deeply moved. And remember that these are the years after the Holocaust. And we heard just the other day, right, that the greatest trauma of the Holocaust actually happened in Nazi-occupied Soviet territories. I mean, 2.5 million people were killed in the territories that were under Soviet control as of June 22nd of 41, and then Nazis overran them. So it's thousands of mass graves, right? Millions of people disappear without a trace. Nobody keeps any documentation. These are early years, right? It's not like later on when the Nazis keep track of everyone who boards the trains and gets into the camps. So here they are, and Golda meets Soviet Jewry. He sees that there are still Soviet Jews, and of course she herself had been born in Kiev. It's really, it's very emotional and moving moment for her. But all of that provokes Stalin's famous propaganda. And he's now sure, again, as Naya was saying yesterday, that he's got a fifth column on his hands. It's not that he didn't think about it before. I mean, he really was always suspicious about Jews and then increasingly of Zionists. And as we know already in 13, he didn't like the Zionists. But basically, this is the point when a massive anti-Jewish campaign is launched. That same month, the arrests of Jewish intelligentsia begin. And this is the start also of the anti-cosmopolitan campaign. Now, I'll show you, this is a picture of a group of really well-known Russian intellectuals. I'm not going to name them for you. If you want, I can give this to you, but it just for you, to show you a picture. But actually, the first salvo in this campaign had been fired in January of 1948 with the murder of Solomon Michols, a very well-known, celebrated Russian Jewish actor. So you see him here on the right. He's in his very famous role of King Lear. It's a really legendary role. So the KGB staged his murder such that it would look as though he had been accidentally hit by a truck on a visit to Minsk. So there was just massive kind of outpouring of grief. But those who really knew how to read the Kremlin's tea leaves understood that this was a signal. That this was a signal, a warning shot for Soviet Jews to tread carefully, because they'd kind of gone out of hand a little bit. Michols had been, he was a leader of the surviving Jewish intelligentsia. He had been to America during the war to raise funds for Stalin's war effort, and here's a picture of him with Einstein. So and he was now, in the late 40s, working hard to publish a book about the destruction of Soviet Jewry during the Holocaust. So he had to be eliminated. And it was a warning shot for Soviet Jews to sit quietly. Golda's visit kind of proved to Stalin that he now had to act. And so that's the beginning of the anti-cosmopolitan campaign. And what is that? It was an anti-Semitic campaign which said that Jews lacked national sentiments. They were disloyal. They were ruthless cosmopolitans. They were the minions of American capitalism. They did not really view Russian culture as their own. And importantly, the arrest of Jewish intelligentsia that continued through 1949, the Jewish intelligentsia is accused of bourgeois nationalist sentiment. What does that mean? It means nationalism, which in the context of Jews means Zionism. They are accused of serving American and Zionist intelligence services. And eventually, they are murdered in August of 1952. They are tortured, they're interrogated, they're made to confess, but they, to their enormous credit, which I don't understand. I've read through the transcripts of those interrogations, and I don't understand how they found the courage to retract their confessions. But they were shot anyway, secretly, and for years nobody knew where they were. The friends that they met in America, like what you see here, American communists, American Jews, wondered for years what happened to them. Where did their Soviet Jewish friends disappear? And it was only after the death of Stalin that they learned that they had been murdered. Jews are expelled from jobs and universities. They're branded, again, as servants of capitalism. Then in November 1952, Moscow engineers a show trial in Prague, and it's the Slansky trial. So Slansky and 14 other top-level Czech communists were arrested. Most of them were Jews. They were also accused of harboring Zionist sentiments, of being agents of the Mossad. Now, of course, I'll show you a picture of Slansky. Slansky was a prominent communist. He was a very loyal communist. And as a loyal communist, he actually was anti-Zionist. Because if you were a communist, you had to assume the anti-Zionist stance. He was, and the rest of them were given a confession to read. I'll show you another picture, just because, I find these, you only need to look at these two photographs to understand what was going on there, right? This is a broken man. I mean, he was tortured. He was forced to say things that he didn't believe, right? So he admitted that he was a Zionist. He wasn't. And he was, here's another picture of somebody else. I mean, you could just see fear in this guy's eyes. He actually was one of the few, maybe the only one, who survived. He was given a life sentence, but then he was freed after Stalin died. Right, so all of them, essentially, except for this guy, they're all killed. It's a show trial. They're killed. The show trial unleashes a massive anti-Semitic frenzy. So again, we have to think, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? What happens when you deploy anti-Zionist rhetoric? Why would there be anti-Semitic sentiments when you're unleashing anti-Zionist rhetoric, right? These are just facts of history that we have to ask questions about. Okay, so, and then in Moscow of 1953, in January of 1953, there is a doctor's plot. And there's a lot written about it. If it sounds new to you, it's very easy. Like Stalin's period is actually very well described. The post-67 period, much less so. But the Stalin's period is very well described. So there is a doctor's plot. So there is a claim that Jewish doctors were plotting to poison Stalin and the entire Kremlin leadership. And you look at this cartoon from that time, you see that it's the unmasking of the evil Jew, right? This is such an anti-Semitic cartoon. Again, the Soviet Union that prohibits anti-Semitism publishes this kind of a cartoon. The mask is very symbolic because, one of the kind of concepts of anti-Semitism is that the Jew wears a mask, and the Jew, you never know what's true with the Jew. The Jew is always pretending. So here, the Jew is unmasked and the Jew is kicked out, right? The powerful hand of our socialist, state unmasks the evil Jew, the evil poisoner. Okay. So, and once again here, what are the accusations? So it's a blend of kind of classic anti-Semitic accusation of poisoning, right? It's a very classic one. But they're also charged with Zionist sentiments, the bourgeois nationalist, i.e. Zionist sentiments, and working with foreign intelligence services, including the Zionist intelligence services. Okay, so what's important for our purposes, I'm now through with the Stalin period, and what's important here that I think I want you to take away from this is that from now on, there are no more categories of Jews that are safe or acceptable to the regime, right? Because remember, in the 1920s, the regime said all Jews are fine except for the Jews who are Zionist and religious. right? We love all the Jews except for these two categories. We also don't like capitalist Jews, but there are no more capitalist Jews in the Soviet Union at the time. So, but what happens under late Stalin is that every Jew becomes suspicious as a potential target or agent of Zionist intelligence services. Every Jew is a potential enemy. And, this conspiracist perspective takes off, or rather kind of takes root very easily, in part because the Soviet political system is deeply conspiracist to begin with. If you know anything about the late 1930s, the period of Stalin's repressions, it's a period when paranoia runs wild, when the society believes just crazy things, right? When all of these old communists are put on trial, kind of what happened to Slansky in 52, but this is in the 1930s. All of these communists who everybody thought were just, the most dedicated leaders of this new socialist nation, suddenly they turn out to have been traitors. Suddenly they turn out to have been wearing masks, right? To have been saboteurs. And so it's a society that's anyway receptive to conspiracist ideas. And so period number 3 in the tale of Soviet anti-Zionism is that Soviet anti-Zionism becomes deeply conspiracist and it goes global. And that happens in 1967. So Stalin dies in 1953. And it's the only thing, by the way, that's believed to have saved Soviet Jews. It was the Doctor's Plot was believed to be kind of a prelude to expelling all of the Jews, moving them somewhere into the depths of the country, transferring the entire population, which the Soviet regime did to different ethnic groups. So Stalin dies, the USSR gets involved in the Middle East, begins to support the Arab states and the post-colonial national liberation movement because it sees this territory as a kind of budding, up-and-coming area of influence for it, and certainly as a fertile ground for the Soviet ideology. And so now we get to the spring of 1967, and the drums of war are sounding, right? There is an expectation that a war with Israel will begin soon. The USSR is arming Egypt and Syria. And it is certain that these countries are going to defeat Israel because how could they not? They're so big, and the Soviet Union throws all of its might behind them, right? Arms them, trains its pilots, right? Trains its forces. And in the Soviet propaganda, in Soviet media, there are a lot of articles that begin to appear that essentially foretell the coming destruction of Israel. And it's interesting, when I talk to my dad, and a lot of Jews from that generation who were in their 20s at the time, in 1967, said that they sort of felt a smell of pogrom in the air. Like they knew that if Israel is destroyed, there will be a pogrom against them. Like that would be just unavoidable. But Israel wins. And so the Soviets experienced this victory as a massive political crisis. It undermines everything that they planned on. And the most important thing is that they don't understand how it happened. They just don't get it. It's such a small country, right? Clearly, there must have been some other forces, some dark forces that helped the Soviet Union, that helped Israel win. And remember, this is a conspiracist society, right? So they start to look for like behind the scenes. What is the guiding hand? What is it that helped Israel? And then there are some domestic developments that also frighten them at the same time. So Soviet Jews, now that Israel has won, they're really inspired by this victory. And they suddenly, for all these years, remember that their Jewish identity, that it becomes really suppressed. That's one thing that happens to Soviet Jews as a result of Stalin's period. All of a sudden, Israel wins, and they're saying, wow, well, look, there may be some positive thing to being a Jew. For now, I've only kind of thought about myself as a Jew in a negative way. Like, I can't get into universities I want to get into. My children are taunted in the streets. What does it even mean to be a Jew? Hebrew is prohibited. Religion is prohibited, right? The study of Jewish history is prohibited. What does it mean to be a Jew? Being a Jew is really reduced almost to a racial characteristic. Because how do people in the Soviet Union know that somebody is a Jew? Because they don't wear kippot, they don't wear tzitzit, they don't, there's nothing to identify them as Jews. They don't have mezuzot on their doors. They know it by looking at them, by looking at their Jewish noses, at their Jewish faces, So it's really just a racial characteristic almost. And so now Israel wins, and Jews are asking themselves, well, what does it mean to be a Jew? Here's a country that's building something. It's a Jewish country. It's just done something amazing. I want to know about it. I want to learn Hebrew. I want to know, I want to understand, what is it? What is my history as a Jew? And so the Soviets perceive it as a very dangerous development, so sort of an underground Zionist movement forms that becomes a source of, it produces Jewish activists, of whom Sharansky was one, and, who begin to agitate for learning more about what it means to be a Jew and also for emigrating to Israel. And so the Soviets are all asking themselves, well, who inspired them? Who is telling them to do this? Clearly somebody is guiding them. There is a movement in support of Soviet Jewry in America and in Israel, and the Soviets are saying, well, they connect the dots. So they're like, well, clearly the Zionists are doing all of this. The Zionists are our enemies. Look at what they did to us in Israel. And the Zionists are so powerful. Look at how many Zionists there are in America. Look at how many Jewish communities there are. And there is the Zionist organization, and there's just and they all have the Israeli flag inside of them. And there are just too many Jews in the ACLU, and there are just too many Jews in Congress, and they're all Zionists, obviously. So, so and because they are socialists, and because they follow Lenin, and because they're not allowed to be openly anti-Semitic, they're talking about Zionists. It's not Jews, it's Zionists, right? It's Zionists who are at fault. It's Zionists who are inspiring our Soviet Jews to be against us. It's Zionists who want them to come to Israel. So a whole conspiracy theory is then formed. And I'll talk more about this conspiracy theory next time. But here's what I want us to understand today, is that this is also a time when Soviet anti-Zionism goes global. Why does it go global? Because the Soviets view Zionist threat as global. Jews are global. We saw that, right? They control the world like that Zionist spider. They're everywhere. They control the world. So you have to fight them everywhere. They're in America especially, and they guide American foreign policy, and they also get in the way of good American-Soviet relations, right? So we need to fight Zionists right there. So they start to produce, the propaganda that they start to produce at home, they translate into dozens of languages, and they start to send out these brochures and articles abroad. So here are just a few for you to look at. I think these are mostly in Russian. So these are the kind of books that they produce. I'll show you, take a picture. I'll show you the ones that, I just took a few that are available in English. So these are from the 60s and 70s. So you see, Zionism is a form of racism, Washington and Tel Aviv against the Arabs, Zionism is an instrument of imperialist reaction, Zionism counts on terror, right? Zionism and the Arab Revolution. So this is one thing that they do, and they had a very, very widespread propaganda apparatus. So the Novosti news agency had bureaus in every country in the world, and Radio Moscow broadcast in like 85 languages. And so along with everything else that they're broadcasting and publishing, they're also broadcasting and publishing these messages. So that's one kind of channel through which they communicate these ideas to the global left and to the developing world. And of course, publishing all of this, understand that this is all published in French and in Spanish and in Arabic, in every language. Okay. Here's another example, Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation. I think I included it in your syllabus. So it's just one example, right, of how they took the scholarly establishment, the Soviet scholarly establishment, and made it serve the propaganda purposes. I think, it's as I wrote in this article about Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, unfortunately, his dissertation is a complete profanation of scholarship. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that his dissertation would pass muster in today's American Middle East departments. I really hate to say it, but when you look at it closely, when you look at the footnotes, when you look at what he's quoting, it's a profanation of scholarship. But it was a political project for the Soviets, and so they helped him defend it. And this is a cover from his from the book that he wrote based on the dissertation. And so you see the equation between Zionism and Nazism here. I'll give you another example. Here's an article from the New York Times in 1971. It's written by a very well-known Soviet propagandist, A Soviet View on Jews. I mean, this is a truly extraordinary piece, which includes every cliche of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. If you look for it on the New York Times, know that his name is actually misspelled in their archives. I can give you the correct link. But you know, to the New York Times credit, they understood that they were dealing with propaganda. They surrounded this article at the top and at the bottom with articles by people who were fighting on behalf of Soviet Jewry. So they understood that they need to counterbalance this. But this is all about how Zionists are Nazis and they're new fascists and they're getting in the way of good American Soviet relations, and how good Jews really need to stay away from Zionists. So here's another example. This is the World Marxist Review. It's actually a translation of the magazine that I have here on the left, The Problems of Peace and Socialism. This was a magazine that was published in Prague. It was translated into 26 languages, you know, again, spread all around the world. The World Marxist Review was published in Canada. And so there are some just extraordinary articles there, the articles that communicate the Soviet anti-Zionist ideas that, again, we'll look at them in more detail next time. But so these are some of the channels. You know, they also work through their kind of left-wing allies in the West, the left-wing parties, and not only communist parties. You know, you see communist representatives of communist parties traveling to the Soviet Union to be trained in this anti-Zionist ideology. There are documented cases. But it's not only communists. You know, the Soviets really were omnivorous at this point in the 70s and 80s. They would take anyone who was willing to support their ideas. So what are they doing? They're trying to build alliances, right, around the world. The question often arises, were they doing it because they were genuinely anti-Semitic? Or were they doing it for some other reason? So the scholars, during the Cold War, this was all covered as it was happening. And I think a lot of the Cold War scholars thought that, of course, they're just congenitally anti-Semitic. Look at all of the history of Russian anti-Semitism. This is why they're doing it. They hate the Jews. I actually happen to think that it's more complex, and that there for sure were people among the, you know, Soviet apparatus was complex, right? And there were people who hated the Jews. But overall, I think the political logic was different. The logic of the state was different. I think that they truly did believe that, you know, Jews, Zionists, control the world, and they are against the Soviet Union and Soviet interests, and they need to fight that. And they believed in the conspiracy theory that they concocted. So I don't think there was always hate. There was this kind of logic there. Okay, so again, we'll talk about more of it later. Here I want to show a couple of pictures of, it wasn't just the Soviet Union. So this is Poland. In 1967-68, there was a campaign in Poland. I can send you articles about it. That was anti-Zionist. In the course of this campaign, countless Jews committed suicide, left the country. You know, and this is Poland. Remember, this is Poland, where 3 million Jews were just murdered 20 years before that, right? But so again, this is a campaign against Zionists, but Jews are suffering. Here's this is, if you can see, I don't know if it was a low resolution photo, but if you see there's a guy kind of sweeping away some creatures, and basically it says, let's cleanse out the Zionist dirt from the party. Okay. All right. So how much time we have? Do I have 10-15 minutes? Something like that before we get to talk? 10? Okay. All right. So why don't we look at a few cartoons? Okay. I just want to show you some, for comparison's sake, to bring all of it more into the present moment. Congratulations. You've handled almost an hour of Soviet history. This is really, give yourselves a gold star. Okay. So here is a comparison for you. So on the left, you have a banner, a cartoon called The Banner of the Zionist Gang. It appeared in a Soviet newspaper in 1971. So you see this kind of a connection, interweaving of the swastika and the Star of David. On the right, you have a picture that you may have seen. I mean, I think that this comes from one of these left-wing blogs. I now forget what it's called, but it's a very contemporary image. So you see how, 50 years later, we're still using the same imagery. Here's another example. This is actually from the cover of a brochure that the British Communist Party put out. I tried to buy it. They never sent it to me. I don't know if they looked up my social media profile or something. They thought it would be a provocation. So, basically I donated £5 to the British Communist Party. Got nothing back. Okay, so here's another example. So I showed on the right, I showed you, this is related to Mahmoud Abbas's Soviet dissertation. On the left, this is your standard banner placard from contemporary demonstrations. Nazism equals Zionism, Zionism equals Nazism. Okay, so Abbas, by the way, defended his dissertation in 82. So again, we're talking 40, 50 years difference. Okay, here's another one. This is a little bit more involved, so I'll explain it to you. So on the left is a Soviet cartoon dating to 1967. So it's August 67. It's very soon after the Six-Day War. So you can see that they're starting already in August, right, to kind of introduce some ideas. So what you see here is an Israeli soldier holding a weapon, a blood-stained weapon, and on the weapon it says Blitzkrieg. So it's already a reference to Nazi Germany. In the back, there is a sign that says, in Russian, it says Lebensraum, which of course is a German concept for the living space, right? That's what Germans wanted to do, Nazi Germany wanted to do as it was conquering territories. Next to it, you see a Nazi ghost who is holding a blueprint of Auschwitz, and it says the new order, Model Auschwitz, meaning that. What does it mean? Oh, and the cartoon is called A Familiar Assortment. So what does it say? It says that the Israelis are taking over from the Nazis. And, the Nazi is now a ghost, but the real dangerous force, the real Nazis now, are the Israelis and the Zionists. Okay? So this is 1967. In 2010, the Daily Kos published this cartoon that was drawn in 2006. It won the first prize at Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest in 2005. So you see, again, the idea that Israelis are building an Auschwitz, right? But now, of course, the prisoners are not the Jews, but the Palestinians. Here's one more, and it's a penultimate one, and then I'll end with the next one. So here, again, just for you to see, the first two cartoons on the left are from 72 and 71. On the in the first one on the left, an Israeli soldier is dreaming of Hitler in the inside the Jewish star. Behind the soldier, of course, has a weapon that's dripping with blood. Behind the soldier, there's like fires of destruction that are very kind of stylistically, it's how a lot of times the destructions of the Holocaust are portrayed. It's really interesting because this Hitler is almost cute, isn't he? It's like he's just kind of like this cute little cartoonish Hitler, But the real dangerous, because he's imaginary now, he's not real. But the real dangerous person is the Jew who is standing here, the Israeli who is standing here. Same idea with the next cartoon right next to it, right? So this is called The Talent and Its Admirers. And again, the Nazi is inside a picture frame, right, in a museum. It's not a real person, but the real dangerous one, the one who's taking over in every way, is the Israeli. And then on the right, you have a picture it was published on Indie Media. It's a Carlos Latouf cartoon. And you see it's, doesn't even require really an explanation. You have a Palestinian girl in an Auschwitz outfit. You have Israelis who, for some reason, are wearing Nazi uniform. And so that's the connection. And let me finish on the final one. This is actually one of the cartoons that also Naya showed yesterday. This is the one on the left is called According to His Image. What is the phrase? According to his image and likeness, or something like that, right? So this is actually one of the rare mistakes that you see in Soviet cartooning, in Soviet anti-Zionist cartooning. What is the mistake? The mistake is that there is nothing here that indicates that this is a Zionist. This is just a Jew. Look at this. This is a Jew whose shadow takes the form of Hitler. And they just forgot that they're not supposed to be anti-Semitic. They were supposed to be anti-Zionist, right? They forgot about that. So here, it's a Jew with blood dripping from the axe. And I think what's particularly ironic here is that this cartoon was published in a Kishinev newspaper. Of course, if anybody knows anything about the Kishinev pogrom, it's particularly ironic to see a Jew carrying an axe that's dripping with blood. Okay, and on the right, you have a cartoon that was submitted, I believe, also for the Holocaust, Iran's Holocaust contest. And a Jew looks in the mirror and sees himself as a Hitler. So I'll stop here. We'll get into a lot of these tropes more specifically in my next lecture. But so let's talk about it.
Thank you very much, Izabella. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. I'm going to take the prerogative and say a few comments and maybe ask you a question as well. So when you were speaking, it evoked actually some memories. So in 1984, I went to the Soviet Union to visit the leaders of the Refusnik movement. And in those days, it was a bit, I don't know if it was dangerous for a foreigner to go, but anyways.
You would have been followed by the KGB.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But I was like 18 years old, and I would go ask, the KGB would follow me like 5 feet behind. And I'd go ask them for change to get onto the metro, and we were smart aleck kids.
Did you know that you understood?
Oh, yeah.
It was obvious?
It was obvious. They made it obvious.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's an intimidation tactic.
Yeah.
Right?
So we go to the Cosmos Hotel in Moscow, and they were in the middle of a cartoon exhibit or competition for, it was all anti-Zionist cartoons in the lobby. That was our welcome to Moscow. We met, Sharansky was on a hunger strike at the time, and we went to meet his mother and brother. They were in internal exile, and they snuck into Moscow to meet my friends Steven Singerman and I in their friend's house, Lev Blitzstein, I don't know, anyways, it's the home. And on the way out of, so it was a very emotional meeting, and we brought information from the West to the leaders of the Refusnik movement, and they gave us information to smuggle out. We gave them money, we gave them sustenance because they were living underground. If you tried to leave the Soviet Union to go to Israel, they were called refusniks. The government wouldn't allow them to go to the Zionist, racist, colonial entity, and they couldn't work. And in the Soviet Union, if you didn't work, you were a parasite. So a lot of people were hiding underground because you would go to jail if you weren't working for the proletariat revolution. And we came out of this very emotional meeting with everybody, and there were 4 KGB agents in the hallway, and they followed us to Natan's brother and mother drove my friend and I to the hotel. So we get into this little car late at night in a snowstorm, and the KGB followed us. They opened the doors for us. They closed the doors very politely, and one KGB agent knocked on the window. I rolled down the window, and he said, for tourists to be going out at night, late at night, accidents can happen. So you should be careful.
Oh my God. Wow.
So we knew who they were. So we were there for 3 weeks. It was the longest 3 weeks of my life. But it was it was interesting.
No doubt.
So why am I saying this? I'm saying this for 2 reasons. A lot of the imagery and the Soviet propaganda, I know you're going to expound on it, has seeped into the universities, has seeped into what we're seeing at universities. What happened at CUNY a few days ago, I really think is a turning point. Because if Jews are the enemy of the people, if Jews are white supremacist, colonial, apartheid supporters, then we're enemy number 1 in this sort of postmodern, progressive, woke space, right? And now Jewish professors are experiencing, vile anti-Semitism at CUNY and complained are now the subject of an investigation because the racists are complaining and insulting or intimidating the people that should be safeguarding them. So they're under investigation. This reminds me very much of what happened to the Jewish community in the Soviet Union. So it's scary. So we should be aware of what's at stake and what's beginning to gain traction in American and Western European universities, that the Jews are really enemies of all that is good. That's number 1. But on a positive note, Natan often says how students and housewives got together in North America, South America, and Western Europe and organized to fight for Soviet Jews. David Harris will be here next week. He was a leader of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. I was the chairperson in Canada for the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. And it really was students and housewives who got together and ignited awareness, ignited a fire, and got governments in the West to really support the struggle for Soviet Jews and human rights in the Soviet Union. And it changed. The Jews had the option to go to Israel and became free. The Soviet Union collapsed. Maybe it's re-emerging, but that's a whole other story. But there was a big shift, and it was really students and housewives that made a difference. So if you guys are getting a little bit depressed with all this assessments of what's happening in the contemporary context of anti-Semitism, don't be so depressed. Because if the Soviet Jews, if Soviet human rights activists could make such a change in such a tyrannical, oppressive society, an anti-Semitic society, we can do a lot. We really can do a lot. We're sitting here in Oxford. There's a challenge. We're all facing challenges, I guess, in our departments, personally, among our colleagues, but there is a network emerging. And we have the means to communicate and to do work. We're all very intelligent people in this room. ISGAP has taught 400 people. There's a network that you could also get in contact with from all different disciplines, different perspectives, different countries. So there's a lot to do, and we're capable of doing a lot. So don't be depressed. Night.
Okay, Izabella, I love your presentation so much.
Thank you.
In fact, I'm going to try to bring you to this high school in New York. I want them to hear this.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question and a slight different reading on Lenin's opposition to anti-Semitism. I discovered a speech in 1919 that he gave in which he talked about why he's against anti-Semitism, and I just want to, I'm reading, anti-Semitism, Lenin. Anti-Semitism means spreading enmity towards the Jews. When the accursed Tsarist monarchy was living its last days, it tried to incite ignorant workers and peasants against the Jews. The Tsarist, so basically what he's saying is that anti-Semitism is a remnant of, as you said, of capitalism, of the Tsar.
Mm-hmm.
That in reality, when we are fighting anti-Semitism, what we're really fighting is the greater threat of capitalism.
Yes.
So how I read that is that it's not that he's against anti-Semitism, he's weaponizing anti-Semitism because he's against capitalism. So I wanted to ask you about that. And the second question I had is Stalin's essay, which I'm familiar with. How do you read Stalin giving Jews Birabidjan? Why would he do that? Why would he give Jews an autonomous region? Those are my two questions.
So first of all, I don't disagree with your reading on Lenin's anti-Semitism. I think it's a completely valid reading, and I do think that he is fighting against the reactionary Tsarist regime, and so absolutely, I think it's completely valid and probably true. Like, I don't think that he is. We don't know what he feels. Sometimes I give up on trying to think about what people feel. Outwardly, he did say all these things against anti-Semitism, and so maybe it's okay. But I agree with your reading. Birabidjan, it's something that I've never really looked into closely, but I think that part of that may have been is that there was a movement for Jews to have, there was a movement in the Crimea. There were Jews who were agitating for having some kind of a space for themselves. And certainly he was not going to place Jews in the Crimea. It was too strategically important. I think perhaps he wanted to show, hey, don't tell us that we're anti-Semitic. We respect our Jewish people. So here's a land for them that they've never lived in, that they don't want to live in, that nobody wants to go there. But here's a chunk of land for you over there. So I think it's just perhaps a show project. But I'm not an expert on that. So I'm going to say that, this is also open to interpretation. Everybody should do their own research on this.
So I want to thank you for the talk, and I want to say I think one of the most important thing in your talk, and perhaps the most important message of the entire thing, is that what is presented as grassroots is actually, it's almost a conspiracy theory, paradoxically, but that was presented as a grassroots uprising of, normally good people, recognize the evil of Zionism and are doing it, is actually run by very sophisticated propaganda machines at the time. But my question to you is, what would you then say, who is the force, the money, and the thing that is running that same contemporary anti-Zionism, and again, representing it as a grassroots thing?
Well, I think that Charles is doing some investigation into where the money is coming from. That is a big question. Here's my theory, is that these ideas became part of left-wing thinking, simply default left-wing thinking in the 70s and 80s. And they have remained there. It's a very natural thing for the left-wing people to be anti-Zionist, which is what I was trying to say, right? It kind of goes from the beginning, from the early 20th century. Socialists are against Zionism. And so I think it's kind of part of the default thinking. I've talked to some people who used to be part of Trotskyist groups here in the UK, where this movement has been, maybe still is, very strong, and they talk about how being a Trotskyite is you have to be anti-Zionist, you have to be anti-Israel, it's a given. And so, the ideas are all there, and a lot of times you wouldn't even know that they came from the Soviet Union, because the Soviets worked with a lot of influencers. There are a lot of people who published these ideas without indicating where they came from. And so it becomes part of the thinking. Who is kind of, jigging these things today? I mean, I don't know. A lot of people are, I'm sure that there is Iran, I'm sure there are state actors. Some people have said Saudi Arabia. I don't know. That's something that I don't have answers to. It could be the close connection also between the Palestinian Authority and the Western intellectuals. Like these ideas are just there. They're written in multiple languages. So you just pick it up and you go from there. But it all requires more investigation in the contemporary moment. But I can just tell you that I don't think it's Russia really that's doing it. I think Russia is a very minor player today. I mean, this whole Soviet anti-Zionism in Russia, in the former Soviet territories, pretty much collapsed as soon as the USSR collapsed. There are now Russian books written in Russian by Russian scholars who acknowledge that all of that was just an incredible kind of subjugation of the academy by the propaganda machine. So it's very clear over there. You talk to Russians about Zionism as racism, they roll their eyes because they know where it comes from. So I think that there probably some Russian action. I just don't think it's the most prominent one right now. And if it's there, it's not that because they believe that really the way they did in the 60s and 70s, that Zionists are their main enemy. It's just because they like to stir trouble and they like to, it's a hot issue, and so they like to kind of insert themselves into any hot issue. They're not ideological now. They support the far right. They support the far left. But again, it's not the main. I don't believe it's the main actor.
So before I ask Daniel, and then I'll ask you, just a quick thing: Zionism as racism. Do you know where it came from? It was a UN resolution. You know who led the resolution?
Yakov Malik,
He was
Soviet
the ambassador
to the UN. Yakov Malik.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was under the impression. I'm sure he played a role, but you must know more than I do. But Kurt Waldheim was the Secretary General.
Well,
Kurt Waldheim, as maybe you don't know, Kurt Waldheim, it was discovered, was a SS officer in the Nazi regime, engaged in killings in the Balkans. He celebrated the passing of Zionism equals racism at the United Nations at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The countries and the actors that passed the resolution partied at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in 1975 that Erwin Kotler and others were working on. So you can see the legacy of Nazism, of the protocols of fascism, and this passes as progressive intellectual critiques.
This is
clearly Kurt Waldheim was the Secretary General for some younger people who are not familiar with his name.
Secretary General of the United Nations,
Yeah.
Austrian.
And
I mean,
Austrian Prime
yeah,
Minister.
it wouldn't have happened without Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, this is really crucial. I just want to say this is really crucial that we're going to talk about more, because sometimes we kind of get all our minds twisted by trying to figure out which anti-Semitism is worse, left-wing kind or right-wing kind. They're really connected. They're deeply, deeply connected. It's part of the same ideology, and we need to understand it.
This just ends 20 years after the end of the Holocaust when this happens.
Right.
So Daniel.
First, thank you for a really brilliant and clear presentation.
Thank you.
I was really struck by your conclusion that the current extreme left is riding the coattails of Soviet propaganda. And in terms of our mission here of combating anti-Semitism, how can we take that idea and use that?
That's the $1,000,000 question that everybody asks me. So I'll give this talk. I gave this talk to the Camera Fellows, and Camera is an organization that fights anti-Zionism on campus. And they're like, great talk, really interesting. But Noor Erakat is coming to campus on Thursday. I need to ask her a question. How can I use this to ask her a question? The truth is, I don't really have a very specific and direct answer to that. I think that we need to understand, perhaps. It can, I don't know, maybe Naya has ideas, because Naya is an educator. I'm rarely in a classroom. But I think that we just need to, first of all, learn this history, just like we learn Nazi history, the Nazi history of anti-Semitism, just because we need to know. But I think we need to work together to figure out how this can be used practically. Please.
I just want to say about that, and to that point, students are very much aware of the threat of Nazism. They understand. They are not, like you said, they really need to invest the time in understanding the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Because one time I did speak to a classroom of juniors, and I showed them Soviet propaganda, and they almost laughed at me, because to them the Soviet Union could be the Roman Empire, right? As you said. And I was going to even ask, honestly, the younger people here, how, does this help you in understanding why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism?
Did this propaganda help us understand?
The showing this linking help?
Oh, yeah. And personally, I don't view, Soviet Russia as, Rome. But, I thought that's the view of everybody. But I can see, I feel like
They
fellow
laughed
students
at-
would see that, yeah.
They thought, they're like Soviet Union. What do you,
Like Rome in the sense of being in ancient history.
ancient
That's the
history,
sense.
or just irrelevant to us?
Well, even propaganda like this, you feel like it's not relevant. But that one we saw was from 2009. There's still propaganda like that being shared. So.
Well, what's interesting is that people don't say that about Nazi Germany. They still think it's
Yes,
relevant, right?
exactly.
But I think what happened with the Soviet Union, and it's a really kind of big pet peeve of mine, that people truly don't know that history. The history of Stalin's repressions, it's like we have, these people, it's millions of people, right, who were deprived of their homes, who were, if they were not murdered, they were worked to death, they were starved, they were transferred to other areas, they were deprived of rights. It was just horrible, right? It's tens of millions of people. If you take the entire communist bloc, it's much more than that. And not only are they not remembered in Russia, the history of the repressions is essentially erased. All of the signs, like the Holocaust has left us Auschwitz. The Soviet Union left us, hundreds of camps, but they're all destroyed now. Nobody bothered to preserve that infrastructure. So it's almost like it never happened. And so we are now killing these people a second time by refusing to remember them. I see this on social media all the time when people talk to me about, well, God, here she goes again about Stalin and his repressions. It's like, for crying out loud. I actually have my great-grandfather was a victim of Stalin's repressions, which is not at all everybody in Russia has a story like that. It's just it's just part of our history, and somehow we've failed to communicate this history altogether to America.
These are the original. The other point I think was these are the original memes, right? We talk about memes today, but they invented the meme by using this propaganda.
Right.
Oh, okay. My question is two parts. So you mentioned that Soviet socialist Russia was really susceptible to conspiracy theory. So I was wondering, what components or warning signals in a society would make them more susceptible? Is it just it being a multicultural society? Is it weak institutions that aren't transparent? And the second part of my question is, would it being a socialist society and them wanting Jews to be more with their class instead of the cultural group, and then Jews kind of going from this role of being the oppressed to having upward economic mobility, would socialism in a way and would class mobility be like a threat to socialism, like a group not being able to clearly be labeled as oppressed, and does that create part of that environment that's creating this conspiracy?
Okay, so let me ask you answer the first question, and then I may ask you to kind of restate the second one. And I can only keep one thing in my head at a time. Okay, so it's a really interesting question. What made the Soviet society, or what makes a society susceptible to conspiracy theories? I think that honestly, it's not really a question for me. It's a question for political scientists. But I can tell you, if you look at the Stalin society, I'm gonna go back to that. It's a country run by fear, very much. It's total control, right? It's one group that's established total control over the entire society and attempting to consolidate control. So at this time you have the purging of enemies. Stalin's is purging enemies. So it's a consolidation of political control by one group. And certainly in transparent institutions, I mean, what were the institutions in the Soviet Union? They really were wiped out. By the time the Soviet Union ended, it was a complete institutional wasteland. There was nothing because one group owned everything and controlled everything. So I don't know. Presumably, in a democratic society, maybe it's better isolated from that. But we're seeing a rise of conspiracy theories, and so maybe someone can
say a word. I think that if you look at there's many books. Totalitarian systems are built on conspiracy. The essence, when Hannah Arendt writes about totalitarianism, and of course the whole idea of truth and false, and like 1984, we're all familiar. So it's based on that. The very essence is based on it from the first time. The Soviet Union was established after the October Revolution. There is a doctrine, in fact, of how we create reality. And so the very discussion on reality that we talk about today, false news or whatever, it's embedded in this notion, and it comes also from previous regimes. Also in monarchical regimes you had that in the 16th century discussion. So there's lots of literature about what you're asking. It's a very important question. Why conspiracy is so embedded in totalitarianism?
But it's common in our society now, or
Yeah.
it's becoming more common. We have a democratic society.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there were, similarities, or just maybe it's the misinformation and memes spreading on the internet, or what is creating that distrust.
Well, we know that there is.
The monopoly of the media was essential. Now we don't have this monopoly, so lots of things can be propagated. But the monopoly of the media, total monopoly, the identification of the state with the party and so on, of course, allow this type of. Nowadays, it's a different story. I don't want to add to it. You said.
There's also Professor Charles Hill at Yale always said the more conspiracies in the society is an indication of its decline.
Yeah. Well, and another thing to understand also is that a lot of conspiracy theories are the scholarship on conspiracy theories indicates that no matter what the conspiracy theory is about, there will always be something there about Jews. So that's, that really goes back to the idea that when anti-Semitism is on the rise, it's, it begins, but there was a second question.
Well, there's a very patient in the back. Second question. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. No, you're right.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Can you restate your second
then
question?
Sorry.
Oh, okay. So my second question, I want to make it clear. So, just sort of within the framework of socialism, and you labeling groups as the powerful and the powerless, or the oppressed and the oppressor. And then with, Jewish people being very, very economically disenfranchised, and now, kind of moving out of that. And so, is that class solidarity kind of a threat, when you have social mobility with a group? Because you can't clearly label them as just, powerless or powerful.
That's a really good question. Basically, you're asking why is it that once Jews start to move up, then anti-Semitism comes back, essentially. Is that what you're asking? Well, in the Soviet case, it's a little bit more complicated because there are other things that contribute to the return of anti-Semitism. It's really kind of gets fully resurrected. It starts to come back in the 30s, but it really begins to resurrect during World War II. And in part, it has to do with the Holocaust itself. You have a big population that lived under Nazi propaganda for, in Ukraine, for example, for 2 years, right? Very much propagandized by the Nazis. And when the Soviets need to then take over, they're taking control over, they're realizing that they have to take over control of a population that anyway was always hostile to the USSR, and they need to kind of curry favor with them. And so they need to accept certain things and ideas. And some of these ideas are the anti-Semitic ideas, because they can't come to, for example, to Ukraine or Belarus and start saying, well, Jews are the ones who suffered the most, because it's a long story. Wow, I could give a separate lecture about it now. There's a rise of great Russian nationalism that happens during World War II. So I think it's more complicated than just social mobility. There are a lot of really kind of local factors that are happening. So we can talk about it separately.
So you mentioned that around 1952, people were going underground. Jews were going underground out of fear of being labeled Jewish, but cosmopolitan and thought of as having this privilege. And then I'm trying to couch that in McCarthyism over in the U.S. and this posturing of people who may be communist, but mainly Jewish. Jewish artists, Jewish writers were targeted as being Soviet empathizers or sympathizers, and I'm wondering if you're seeing patterns of that now surfacing, that there's a Russia-Ukraine war and people must side with one or the other, or at least we were talking about virtue signaling yesterday, and you're either with us or you're against us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to put this together in a modern context, maybe just for the United States, or for those of us who are seeing that posture.
Well, I mean, in the U.S., I think we're seeing it with Jewish professors kind of starting to hide their identity, for example, on campuses, right? With Jewish students trying to hide their identity because they believe that it can harm them. I think, to me, that there is really a clear parallel to that. Obviously, the level of repression is not nearly what we see with Stalinism. But what's really interesting, and I just was having this conversation with someone just the other day who also comes from the USSR, is that it turns out that you actually don't need a state to impose an ideology that then everybody kind of follows and submits to, especially if this ideology carries, let's say, social punishment, right? Which is why we see so many people now fearing, Sharansky talks about it a lot, right? The double thinking, that people are afraid to express who they are. They're afraid to say what they truly think, especially on these explosive issues, like Israel and Zionism. And it's actually going to exert a toll on people, psychological toll, because we know, you come from the USSR, you know what it's like to live this double life. When you are something at home and you're something completely different outside, it's very difficult psychologically. I think it's already happening. I don't know if it's helpful, but we can continue the conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. My grandmother was from Russia, and then as a child, I remember building in Manhattan, there were all these signs up in the elevator all the time to rally for Soviet Jewry. And, I was telling Naya, I thought it was jewelry when I was tiny. It was like really infused. So this was just very personally, extremely engaging. But here's my question. I'm wondering that you're talking about how people are not recognizing, this propaganda as coming from the Soviet Union. I'm wondering if, in any way, this becomes complicated by Ukraine, because we're also hearing this narrative, right, that that the Russians have to be there because the Ukrainians are Nazis, and so I'm just wondering if Ukraine enters into this conversation at all.
Well, this was true long before this war. So I think that Ukraine, in some ways, I think that what's happening with the Russian propaganda with regards to Ukraine, in some ways actually illustrates some of the points, I think, that I'm trying to make. Because Ukrainians were also, Ukrainian nationalism was very much feared by the Soviets, because the Ukrainians fought against the Soviets. They were not afraid to take up arms. And of course, the Ukrainian case is more complicated because, in fact, some Ukrainians did collaborate with the Nazis. But it doesn't justify this notion that Ukrainians are Nazis, which is what the Soviet propaganda often said, and which is what the Russian propaganda says. When the Russian propaganda today says that Ukrainians are a non-existent nation, or that that their country is not really a real country, it's kind of harkening back to these patterns of thought, right? That you try to undermine a people, a minority, by claiming that they're not real, or their country is not real, or they don't deserve to have a country, or their language is not real, right? It's very similar patterns of kind of this imperialist totalitarian thinking. So in some ways, I feel like it almost helps to illustrate some of these ideas.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So,
Sonia, this will be the last comment, then we're gonna go for a break, but we have time. So.
okay, no, but, you know, Black Chicagoans look at Ukrainians quite different. You know, I was a young man, played baseball for my high school. We got chased out of our baseball game because of the Ukrainians in that area did not want our presence there, right? And so there's a, you know, and then there's a known Nazi who has a statue in Ukraine who was known for his Nazism. So this kind of perplexed dilemma that the information we get in the States particularly is always this white, black, brown man.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's not a lot of sympathy, I hate to say this, for Black Chicagoans who have dealt with a lot of racism from Ukraine Village because we well, we don't really care about either one of you.
Yeah. I mean, look, here's what the war is making really difficult. It's making it really difficult to talk honestly about that history, you know, precisely what you were saying, because there is a history of collaboration with the Nazis, and there is a history recently of a revival of some of the symbols of those groups that collaborated with the Nazis. And I think that is now very, very difficult to discuss. I agree with you.
Apropos, I think in the Canadian context, with Canadian migration, Jewish refugees during the Holocaust were basically, you know, not permitted to come to Canada. Irving Abella wrote this very important book called None is Too Many about Jewish migration during the Holocaust to Canada. Canada had among the worst records in the world on accepting Jews, but they took much more Nazi war criminals than Jewish people, and many Ukrainian fascists.
Yeah.
So a lot of the Ukrainians in Canada, their roots are fascist, and also horrible experiences with the community there. So, in a way, I've been pretty quiet on this situation because it's terrible what's happening. Everybody should be well and healthy.
Yeah.
But it's a painful history.
Yeah.
All right. So, Izabella, thank you so much.
Thank you.